my whole life I've never seen this. This is a shadow on the mountain.
America had barely risen from the most unprecedented winter storm in recent memory, when the sky over the Gulf of Texas suddenly split open with violent, out-of-season thunder arriving so fast that radar barely registered it. Before the shock faded, the Southwest tightened under severe drought, cracked earth, empty reservoirs, and dry lightning striking desert ground without a single drop of rain. Then floodwaters surged in, sweeping through basins and washes, but when the water withdrew, something unexpected remained. Unfamiliar green shoots emerging from soil long believed lifeless. And just as scientists debated climate cycles, a dark object hovered motionless over Arizona for nearly 20 minutes, silent, fixed, and unexplained, suggesting the sequence was not yet over. Is this simply a series of unrelated events, or a moment of alignment meant to be noticed? If these questions stay with you, share your readiness in the comments section and stay close before we continue observing what may be unfolding. The calm returned slowly after the most unprecedented winter storm in recent American memory. Entire neighborhoods had been buried under record snowfall. Power grids failed. Highways disappeared beneath ice. When it finally passed, the country exhaled. Snow began to melt. Streets reopened. Children returned to school. The air felt clean again, washed by weeks of hardship. In a coastal town along the Gulf of Texas, the sky on that particular afternoon carried the fragile stillness of recovery. Lawns were finally visible beneath shrinking drifts. Repair crews worked under pale sunlight. It seemed as if peace had just been restored. Then, the horizon darkened. Not gradually, as weather systems usually announce themselves on radar days in advance. Not with the distant roll of predictable thunder. The clouds gathered with startling speed, folding in on themselves like a curtain pulled tight across the sky. Within minutes, daylight thinned into a bruised gray. Wind shifted direction without warning. The air pressure dropped sharply enough that doors creaked in their frames. The first thunderclap did not rumble, it cracked, a sharp, splitting sound that seemed to strike both sky and ground at once. Lightning followed in vertical spears, tearing downward in repeated bursts. Streets that had only just dried from melting snow were suddenly rivers again, but this time under sheets of cold, driving rain. Meteorologists would later describe it as an isolated convective anomaly, an unstable clash of warm Gulf moisture and lingering Arctic air. But residents felt something else, the shock of disruption arriving precisely when stability had just been reclaimed. What unsettled observers most was not simply the violence of the storm, but its timing. The land had barely recovered. Foundations were still drying. Creeks were already swollen from thaw. It felt less like a seasonal shift, and more like interruption, peace interrupted before it could take root. It was here, in conversations among pastors and residents sheltering in darkened homes, that the scripture quietly entered discussion. Some recalled the words of the prophet Nahum. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Nahum 1-3. The reference was not shouted as a declaration, nor framed as a prediction fulfilled. It was offered as reflection. In the Hebrew scriptures, storms often mark moments of transition, judgment, warning, or the shifting of seasons in a nation's story. From Sinai's thunder in Exodus to the whirlwinds that carried messages through prophets, weather is rarely described as random background noise. No one claimed this Gulf storm was a direct sign. No prophecy was announced as complete. Yet the pattern, a record winter upheaval, followed by sudden thunder from a clear horizon, left room for contemplation. The people who had just learned how fragile peace can be now understood, and even more deeply because what unfolds next is where the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Across parts of the American Southwest, months had passed without meaningful rain. In regions of southern Arizona and eastern California, the land had hardened into a pale, fractured crust. Reservoirs receded to historic lows. Riverbeds turned to dust. The drought was not sudden. It was relentless. Each week arrived hotter and drier than the last, and what had once been seasonal dryness became something far more severe. The absence of water reshaped everything. Fields lay fallow. Wells were drilled deeper. Wild grasses crisped into tinder beneath a white, unbroken sky. It was not dramatic like a storm. It was steady, grinding depletion, the kind that erodes confidence before it erodes soil. As the drought deepened, the ground itself began to change color. Patches of earth turned chalky and gray, while other areas darkened where minerals surfaced through evaporation. Dry lakebeds revealed streaks of rust-red sediment long hidden beneath shallow water. Early explanations pointed to normal chemical processes, oxidation, salt concentration, mineral exposure. All technically sound. Yet the speed at which landscapes transformed unsettled long-time residents. Terrain that had looked stable only months earlier now appeared raw and altered. Heat intensified alongside the dryness. Afternoon temperatures climbed above seasonal averages, but the greater strain came from persistence. Nights offered little relief. Air remained heavy and still, as if movement itself had stalled. The wind that did rise carried dust instead of moisture, coating cars, windows, and lungs. Energy grids strained under constant demand. Conversations shifted from inconvenience to endurance. Then came something more unusual. Isolated lightning strikes began appearing over open desert bright, vertical flashes against otherwise cloudless skies. There were no full storm systems, no rolling thunderheads sweeping across the horizon. Just brief discharges of electricity, striking dry ground without rain. Some sparked small brush fires before dying quickly. Others vanished without trace. Meteorologists described them as dry lightning events, born from unstable upper-level air. The explanation made sense. The timing, layered onto extreme drought, felt heavier. Individually, none of these elements are mysterious. Drought cycles are documented. Mineral shifts follow evaporation. Heat waves intensify under climate patterns. Dry lightning is a known phenomenon in arid regions, but when parched land, altered earth tones, suffocating heat, and fire-bearing lightning converge at once, the feeling changes. It no longer seems like isolated conditions, it feels like compounded pressure. In regions already defined by scarcity, such convergence does not spark panic, it sharpens awareness. Ranchers check fences twice. Fire crews remain on alert. Families watch the horizon with quiet calculation. People begin asking not only how long the drought will last, but what sustained strain does to a place, and to those who live within it. This is not catastrophe declared in a single moment, it is tension stretched thin. In landscapes where survival depends on balance between sky and soil, prolonged imbalance carries weight. Because when earth dries, air thickens, and lightning falls without rain, the question shifts. It is no longer simply whether relief will come, but how much the land can endure before something larger changes. In the drought-stricken stretches of southern Arizona and the inland valleys of California, relief did not arrive gently. After months of severe dryness, a rare atmospheric river had surged through the region weeks earlier, swelling dry washes, flooding desert basins, and briefly turning dust into moving water. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the water receded. What it left behind was not silence. As the floodwaters pulled back into shrinking reservoirs and underground channels, the desert floor began to change. Within days, patches of green pierced through soil that had looked lifeless for nearly a year. Small shoots appeared in clusters tight, bright, and unfamiliar. In some areas, botanists recorded germination patterns rarely documented in modern surveys. Seeds long buried beneath layers of hardened sediment had awakened. The speed drew attention. This was not gradual seasonal growth. It felt accelerated, almost urgent. Valleys that had been chalk gray turned lightly dusted with green. Along dry lakebeds once cracked and brittle, Thin stems rose in straight lines, some crowned with small white and violet blooms. Satellite images confirmed what residents were seeing on the ground, life emerging in places that had not supported visible growth in years. Researchers offered explanation. Desert ecosystems are known for seed dormancy. Some species can remain inactive for decades, waiting for the right combination of saturation and temperature. The flood had penetrated deeper than typical rainfall, unlocking layers of biological potential. Scientifically, the phenomenon was sound. Yet the convergence, extreme drought, sudden overwhelming water, and then unprecedented bloom shifted the conversation beyond botany. Ranchers who had watched their land crack open now stood in fields lightly brushed with color. Communities that had rationed water now saw fragile life, pushing upward from beneath their feet. It was in that contrast, desolation, followed by unexpected renewal, that the Old Testament quietly entered discussion. Some recalled the words of the prophet Isaiah, "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the rose." Isaiah 35:1. What unsettled and inspired observers alike was not just the growth itself, but what it suggested. Beneath seasons of visible dryness, unseen potential had remained intact. The drought had not erased it, the flood had not destroyed it. Instead, both seemed to prepare the ground. Taken alone, drought is explainable. Flood is explainable. Sudden bloom is explainable. But together, extreme loss, overwhelming water, and emergence of dormant life, the pattern begins to feel deliberate. The desert did not transform into forest. The bloom was fragile and temporary, yet it was undeniable. In a region defined by scarcity, even a brief flowering commands attention. Because when life rises from ground long considered barren, the question shifts. It is no longer only about climate cycles or rainfall totals. It becomes a quieter inquiry. What else lies dormant beneath seasons of hardship, waiting for its appointed time to rise? In a mid-sized city, in the American Southwest, on the edge of drought-scarred land in Arizona, residents were still adjusting to the strange desert bloom that had followed weeks of flooding. The ground had only just stabilized. The air had only just cleared. It seemed that the cycle of extremes had finally slowed. Then attention shifted upward. Late one afternoon, witnesses across several neighborhoods reported a dark, motionless object suspended high above the city. It did not glide like a drone. It did not blink like an aircraft. For nearly 20 minutes, it remained fixed against a pale blue sky. Winds moved thin clouds behind it, proving the air was not still, yet the object did not drift. There was no sound, no visible propulsion. Videos spread quickly. Some residents stepped outside with phones raised, speaking in hushed tones. Others dismissed it immediately. Just a balloon, just perspective, just another internet illusion. Social media split in hours. Curiosity clashed with ridicule. City officials responded with caution. The local government released a short statement, noting that no unauthorized aircraft had been detected on radar. The regional office of the Federal Aviation Administration confirmed there were no registered flight anomalies at that altitude. Authorities urged calm and warned against speculation. No emergency was declared. Yet behavior on the ground added another layer. Flocks of birds approached the airspace and began circling in tight, repeated patterns. They did not scatter, as they often do around helicopters or loud disturbances. Instead, they looped deliberately, maintaining formation. Residents who had lived there for decades remarked that they had never seen birds respond so calmly to something unknown overhead. While cameras focused on the sky, a separate incident unfolded miles away. In a quiet residential block, a two-story commercial building collapsed without warning. Inspectors later reported no prior structural violations, no recent seismic readings, no gas explosion. The failure was abrupt, but strangely contained floors giving way inward rather than outward. Miraculously, occupants had exited minutes before. Officials attributed it to possible hidden foundation fatigue, pending investigation. Engineers promised a full review. Some citizens accepted the explanation. Others noted the timing and asked harder questions. That same evening, several concentrated lightning strikes hit isolated zones outside the city limits. There were no storm fronts, no rolling thunderheads. The bolts fell almost vertically, striking dry ground in narrow clusters before stopping as suddenly as they began. A brief power outage followed, then silence. Meteorologists described it as rare atmospheric instability, dry lightning, caused by upper-level energy shifts. And then came the final report. An old mesquite tree, deep-rooted and healthy, by all prior assessments, split apart from the inside. There was no wind event, no lightning scar. Witnesses described a sharp internal crack before the trunk burst outward, scattering bark but leaving surrounding shrubs untouched. Arborists later suggested internal decay, not visible from the surface. Still, longtime neighbors insisted the tree had shown no sign of weakness. Individually, each event carried a plausible explanation. Misidentified aerial objects are common. Buildings fail for hidden reasons. Lightning behaves unpredictably in arid climates. Trees rot from within. But what unsettled many was convergence. Sky, structure, weather, and living matter, all deviating from expectation within the same narrow window of time. None escalated into catastrophe. None demanded evacuation. Yet together they created a pause in public confidence. Reactions divided sharply. Some residents gathered in churches that evening, reflecting on Old Testament passages that speak of signs unfolding across both heaven and earth. A few referenced the words of the prophet Joel, "I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth." Joel 2:30. They did not claim fulfillment, only resonance. Others criticized such connections as premature and harmful. Local officials emphasized infrastructure reviews and atmospheric data. State representatives cautioned against spreading fear. News anchors urged viewers to rely on verified sources. By the next morning, traffic resumed. Repair crews assessed the collapsed structure. Utility teams restored power. The sky returned to an empty blue. Yet something intangible lingered. Not fear, but awareness. The sense that ordinary patterns had briefly thinned, revealing how quickly stability can shift. In a country accustomed to measurable explanations and rapid clarification, the absence of clear linkage between events left a rare space, quiet, unresolved, and difficult to dismiss. In the days that followed, the sky remained clear. No storm fronts, no pressure drops, no unusual cloud formations. Weather data showed nothing out of place. By every standard forecast, conditions were normal. Yet beneath that calm, small irregularities began to surface. Brief magnetic fluctuations were recorded by regional monitoring stations. Such disturbances are often tied to solar activity, but agencies tracking space weather, including the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, reported no solar flares or geomagnetic storms. The disruption appeared localized and short-lived. At the same time, minor technical issues emerged. GPS signals drifted slightly off position. Cell service dropped and reconnected without clear cause. A few digital systems logged synchronization errors before correcting themselves. None of the glitches caused damage, and infrastructure checks revealed no hardware failure. Still, the overlap in timing drew quiet attention. Pilots flying commercial routes over the region later reported brief instrument inconsistencies, readings that flickered, then stabilized. No emergency procedures were required. No flight paths changed. The anomalies were logged and dismissed as isolated, yet they lacked a clear trigger. Animals responded before most people noticed anything. Dogs barked at empty yards. Birds shifted direction mid-flight. Livestock grew restless, then calmed. The behavior passed quickly, leaving no trace beyond memory. On the ground, The atmosphere felt different, not chaotic, just muted. Public spaces grew unusually subdued. Conversations softened. Movements slowed. There was no public alarm, only a shared sense that something subtle had moved through and then withdrawn. For some, the moment carried an echo of scripture. Language wonders that appear without spectacle. Signs that do not demand fear, but invite attention. No declaration followed. The sky remained blue. But the calm felt less simple than before. If this analysis resonates with you, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and continue watching, because what followed would soon move beyond subtle signals and into unmistakable alignment.